PhD, or you're thinking about doing a PhD, or you've just finished one, and you're thinking about an academic career or another career, there's a whole load of stuff that you need to have in place in terms of how you get there, right? If you go back 20 or 30 years, having a PhD was enough to get you an academic position, a permanent academic job, probably. In the social sciences, in STEM subjects, it's different. You do postdoc after postdoc after postdoc after postdoc. That's kind of the way it works. It's different in the social sciences. Also, we were talking just now that in the social sciences, people tend to do their PhDs slightly later in life. You know, they're not necessarily 23, just finished a bachelor's degree and those kinds of things. But if you go back 20 years, having a PhD was probably enough to have on your CV. For various reasons now, it's not. And the question is how you accumulate all of that other stuff on your CV in order to be able to give yourself a chance of getting a job. Some of this, kind of the fact that you need more, is to do with competition. So there are much more people doing PhDs than there were ever before. And in some senses, that's a really good thing. It means that there are more people who are PhD educated. In terms of the job market, it also means that it's a bit more congested than it used to be. And this means that it's more competitive, and then there are some people who have more an advantage over others. I hate the idea of competition. It's hideous. But I suppose there's a way of learning how to play the game and play it nicely, which is, I suppose, like a constant battle. So if you look at the URL on there, sorry, it's not very catchy, but if you type that into your phone or your tablet or your laptop, this is a thing that I hope we can add to all the way through the session. So, in a sense, I'll show you quickly before I go back. So basically, on your CV, I'm guessing you kind of know already that there are certain things you need to have, such as publications, such as teaching experience, such as, let's say, soft skills, right? So these are various things that you need to accumulate on the way. And the question is the last question is, where do you get those things from? So if you open that thing up, I'll go back, and then you can just add stuff as we go through to think about what fits in each of those columns. Does that make sense? So one of the things that was really interesting about the slide about people's trajectories is people follow very different routes. There's an idea, particularly from the funding councils, that funding, if you can get it, is based on the idea that you're 24, living in a shared house and don't have any responsibilities. How many people does that fit when they did their PhD? Okay, just two. Okay, so that kind of shows that the social science funding model is wrong, right? In that it's geared towards a certain kind of lifestyle, which in the social sciences doesn't really exist. But there it is. And then how many people worked for at least a couple of years before they did their PhD? Yeah, okay. So you have all of this stuff, and that brings an awful lot with you. But it isn't necessarily useful on your CV, but it does give you useful experience. So the question is how do you get from kind of the end of your PhD to somewhere else? Now, in terms of research, of course, you need to have publications. But of course, it's very difficult to get publications during your PhD. Partly because on your PhD, you don't know what to say yet, right? You don't really know what you're going to be saying until you get quite close to the end of it. Unless you work with a supervisor and you're working on a project and there are publications that come from that, right? So it can be quite difficult to get publications before the end of your PhD, unless you're doing a PhD by publication. And that's a different kind of model. So that can be a bit tricky. And of course, in a way that also relates to the STEM subjects where you're working in a research group and there are publications coming out of your research group. So in a way, so you need publications. You need research experience. So, you know, ideally, if you can get work as an RA while you're doing your PhD, that's great, to be working on a research project. But of course, then that's difficult. Because if you have funding, you're expected to complete in 3 years. So then fitting anything else in while you're doing it becomes difficult because it slows you down, right? If you imagine that a PhD, I mean, how many people have got their PhDs? How many people completed in 3 years? Yeah, no, don't be shy if you did, but in a sense, the problem is the system is kind of almost in a way If it takes 3 years to do a PhD and you need to do other stuff alongside it, all of a sudden it doesn't fit, right? So this is a real problem. So you can do your PhD in 3 years, but it means it's quite difficult to do other stuff that goes along with it. So also, I was at the University of Bristol when I did my PhD, and it was a graduate school of education. So if you need to have teaching experience, the problem is as a PhD student, until you upgraded to PhD status from MPhil, you couldn't do any teaching because they only had master's students. So whenever any jobs came up for teaching experience, everybody wants teaching experience, partly because they like teaching and partly because you need to have it on your CV. And there were like 50 people in one position. So that made it really, really difficult. So it was quite difficult to get teaching experience. And then also you now need to have fellowship of the Higher Education Academy. Not at the end of your PhD, but you need to get this. So whenever you start a lectureship, if you haven't got it, it's kind of built into the process. And from experience, I did a postgraduate certificate in teaching and learning in higher education, which got me my fellowship of the Higher Education Academy. And the problem was it was a really badly taught course, which is kind of ironic, right? I mean, it was an example on how to teach through an example of how not to teach. Does that ring any bells for anyone else? So this in itself is tricky, plus added to the fact that you're in a new job, you're trying to work out how it all functions, you've got a full workload, and you've got this postgraduate certificate. So you end up doing all of those things that you tell your students not to do, like don't skim read, don't write your stuff last minute, all of that stuff, and you end up doing it. Which is really difficult because you want to get the most out of the course, but actually it's quite hard to do because there's all of this other pressure. And then you go to these teaching sessions and nobody really wants to be there. Some people because they're not very interested in teaching or thinking about pedagogy, and other people because they haven't got time. And then you need a bunch of other stuff on your CV. So it's going to be interesting to see what comes up on the Padlet, if anything. What kinds of things do you need in addition to teaching and research that make you employable? I suppose from a strategic sense. But there's a whole load of stuff that's kind of built into the academic job in a way that that is useful to have. And one of the things that's interesting in the last at least 5 years or so is there's been a real push on career development during the PhD. So how many of you know about the Vitae Research and Development Framework? Yeah. Okay, so not so many. And that in itself is interesting. And then depending on where you do your PhD or wherever you're working, there is more or less stuff available. So when I was at Bristol, they had loads and loads and loads of sessions. I didn't know anything about career development while I was doing my PhD. But as I finished my PhD, I got a part-time job in academic staff development, and then I found out all about it. And I was thinking, why did I not know about this during my PhD? So I kind of learned it the hard way. And you can look at lots of online sources, and you can look at the research and development framework and find out lots of things that you need to have on your CV in addition to your research, in addition to your teaching. Things like, let's say, public engagement or conference attendance and these kinds of things. But then within your institution or wherever you're working, can you actually do those things? So I worked at a university until fairly recently that didn't really have much research development within the PhD phase. So they didn't have very many workshops on how to apply for jobs. They didn't and these kinds of things. So if you're in a really big university, you may find that they've got loads and loads and loads of different things that you can attend. And so partly that means that you're able to find out about what you need to have on your CV, and also you're able to get it. If you're in a much smaller institution, or a less well-developed institution, or a less nurturing institution, then maybe that can be quite difficult. And one of the things that I've found is that, in a way, getting hold of this information, some of it happens over the water cooler, and some of it happens formally. You look at job applications, and you suddenly realize all of the things that they have that you need that you haven't got, right? So you kind of find out late the hard way. And then you start thinking about, okay, I need to get this, I need to get this, I need to get this. And actually, for me, the most useful thing to me ever was having probably, I can name 4 colleagues who at various points have taken me under their wing at really, really crucial points in my career. And this is informal stuff, and they kind of fill in the stuff between the gaps. So I'm not going to name names. Actually, at one point, they all worked in the same institution, which is kind of interesting in itself. But people who were kind of a couple of years ahead of you, or even a long way ahead of you, who kind of teach you how to play the game. So for example, when you give a presentation in terms of a job interview, so you go for an academic job and you have to do a presentation on whatever it is they've set you. So in a teaching-oriented university, it's more about what are you going to teach and how do you fit within our teaching culture. Within a more of a research institution, it's more about how does your research fit within our organizational strategy or departmental culture and these kinds of things. And that's kind of interesting because they're asking very different kinds of things of you, but of course you always have to talk about teaching and research. They're just more or less interested in either. So in a way you need to develop yourself as you go along, and that's part of what we do in terms of our careers. We are self-developers, right, to a certain extent. But the question is how much do you know about what you need? Even if you know about it, can you get it? And also, do you have supporting people around you? There are plenty of people in academia who aren't necessarily interested in helping people just behind them for various reasons. I'm really, really, really lucky to be surrounded by lots of nice people, and that makes a fundamental difference. I wouldn't be where I am. I've kind of got my dream job now, give or take. It's not perfect because perfect doesn't exist, right? But at the same time, I wouldn't be there unless a couple of people hadn't intervened at various points, particularly within the last couple of years. There are things that I just would not have known in the terms of the way you write your CV. Has anyone applied for an academic job recently? So when you start filling in the criteria, and the really annoying thing is you can't just write kind of, each application is slightly different, so you have to start each one from scratch. Plus you have to spend an hour and a half filling in all of these boxes about your CV. And then you have to upload your CV for all the stuff that's on your CV, which in itself is frustrating. And applying for jobs is tiring. At the end of towards the end of my PhD, and in between that and getting my first permanent job, I mean, I was lucky in that I spent a year after my PhD and then I was in a permanent job. And that's really, really, I think it's unusual, and it's also super lucky. And, applying for jobs is, one of the things that's difficult is that academic job or adverts look quite broad, but they're often looking for something quite specific, and it's difficult to know what that is. And so you don't know what they really want until you've got it, and then you find out in hindsight, oh, this is why I fit. So that's kind of a tricky one. So I was just wondering how this is looking, if anything. Ooh, okay. Da, 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 da. Yeah, so there's a bunch of stuff going up there. I was thinking that maybe we can maybe people can add to that. If they've already got it open, then as other people are talking, as the discussion goes along, maybe we can add to that stuff. Kind of interesting, mentorship. I mean, mentorship is kind of the thing that for me has been the most useful. I said there's kind of those informal connections of people that you speak to who are really collegially minded and want to help you get a leg up. And for me, that's been the key. The difference between, well, I suppose doing all right and doing well, I think has been the fundamental difference for me. So, I mean, that's kind of where I'm at for my stuff. So, are you going to talk and then we'll do questions? Sure. Okay. Do you want this one? Would you want to stand? Should I leave that one up there?
Yes, that's really helpful. Thank you. Okay, now for the slightly lower tech version. I'm kind of the individual session to Richard's keynote here. So also I have to say I'm extremely embarrassed. I'm absolutely drenched from walking here. This is one of the reasons why I don't live in the UK very much anymore. But rain aside, I'm really delighted to be here. It's always a pleasure to come, invited by Uwe and by Oliver. And as you know, academics love to talk about themselves. So who would say no, even though it's at an ungodly hour, we can't help ourselves. Okay. Richard, I mean, jokes aside, that was really useful for you to sort of pan out some of the main issues. I suppose I'll talk about personal experience now as well, and I know you're keen to do that. And just to reiterate what was said, that we recognise that there are many, many different routes into academia, and there are quite a few routes out of it as well. And unfortunately, that is, well, I say unfortunately, that's the reality, but I also want to say that there's no shame in leaving. And if any of you use Twitter a lot, or perhaps if you're part of the Women in Academia Support Network, I know a few of you are, you'll know that these stories of struggling in academia are not uncommon, unfortunately. But I suppose I want to show you that that is the reality, and I recognize that. But there are ways of surviving and also thriving. So I realize that Richard and I have not met, but I follow him on Twitter. So actually it's a great pleasure to meet you today, and a few faces I recognize as well, also from Twitter. And I suppose that's an important point, that even in your institution, if you get your first academic job, it might not be your first job, your first academic job, that you may not find the support that you need in your institution, but that doesn't need to be the end of the story. There are other places that you can find support. Online is really good these days. I really find Twitter really helpful, at least to know that you're not the only person going through a particular issue. And these kind of conferences as well. And certainly, I've been coming to BERA for quite a while. Maybe this is the 7th year or something like that. I started somewhere during the PhD process. And it can take some time, so if it's your first time, second time, even third time, you might sort of come and wonder, what did I really get from it? But I can say that, once you start to network or find key people, and I think that's really important, key people who really want to help you and really want to give you a leg up, that can open up a whole other world of support and other people who are just like you. And personally, I've found that really encouraging and a kind of a place to go, I suppose, when perhaps you're not getting all of the sort of intellectual stimulation, I suppose, where you are, depending on what your job is. So I really want to recognise here, I know he's not here, but I really want to recognise my own PhD supervisor, Joanne Hughes, who's at Queen's University, who has always been there even during my post-PhD phase. I really look up to her as a woman who's made her way in academia against the odds, really. And also Richard Race, who is really involved in the race ethnicity SIG. He is a great connector, and you really need people like that. Just on a very simple level, that when you're in a crowded space and you don't really know anyone, that someone will introduce you to somebody else and to somebody else, and I really try and do that myself now. Those kind of things that people have modelled to me. A bit sort of more about my specific journey. So I started my PhD in 2010 at the age of 28, and I feel that's significant, and especially, again, for women to know that many of us have done something before the PhD. The PhD's not the first step necessarily, it might be the third, fourth, whatever step in your career. And I'd done English language teaching before. I'd studied a lot part-time to fund my studies. I had done administrative jobs, waitressing jobs, lots of different jobs. But when I got the opportunity to do the PhD at age 28, I really didn't know anything about academia. I mean, all of this kind of stuff, when we talk about it, really sounds quite neat, and you think, right, you have to do this, and you have to do this, and you have to do this, and speak to this person. I mean, I literally didn't know anything. And I also knew very little about my topic, even though it was about my home country, I must admit. So it doesn't, even if at this stage, if you feel like you don't really know what you're doing, and you're perhaps not even sure that you want to go into academia, that's okay. You don't necessarily need to know everything, and in some ways, if you knew everything, maybe you wouldn't do it. So a little information can sometimes be a bit more useful than too much. I'm not sure I want to say anything more. Maybe wait for some of the questions, and if you want to know a little bit more about how I got to where I am, I'll tell you then. But I will say that I now don't work in the UK 5 years post-PhD. I work in China, so you might want to ask me why that is. Okay?
Okay, great. Thanks for Richard and Helen for sharing your experiences very briefly and quickly. Now we open up the dialogues, and you're all more than welcome to share your experiences if you want to. But also, if you've got questions, you're more than welcome to ask us. As we say, we all come from different backgrounds and we have different trajectories into the post-PhD phase. So you're more than free to ask questions and also share your experiences. Anyone wants to be the first bird? We have this. Yeah.
I just want you to finish off what you said. Don't leave me hanging. Why did you leave?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh, lots of different reasons. Some political that I probably can't, well, I will choose not to talk about publicly, but we can talk personally. But actually I had quite a not dissimilar trajectory, as I said, from Richard, in that I was at a very teaching-focused institution, which also, by the way, is not a bad thing in and of itself. I do want to say that because I know that the higher up you go in academia, the lower these institutions, their reputation seems to be. But personally, I really enjoy teaching, so it wasn't a terrible choice. And in some ways, it wasn't necessarily even a choice. I mean, we need to eat, so I needed to take a job. So, yeah, so I was there for 4 years with a full teaching load, which also can mean different things to different people. And in some more elite universities, they think they have a high teaching load, but no, it's quite different world in some ways. But, you know, as much as at the start of that, I felt like I was able to carve out places for myself. You know, I really felt that research, unfortunately, in some ways felt like a hobby. I mean, a really nice hobby that I really enjoyed, but it was quite sidelined. It was officially 10% of my workload, so that's about half a day a week. And I did claim that because I realized that, you know, we are all self-developers as much as we would hope that the institution would support us. If that's not the case and you can't find a way to change that, then you have to think about yourself. So I carved out that space and I really used these kind of conferences, and I really enjoyed traveling, so I took those opportunities. And those are things that you can do also at teaching-focused institutions. There may not be so much money, it might be a bit more difficult to fit things around, but it is possible to do these things. And I suppose it's not enough just to say, oh, well, my institution won't help me, and then that's it, because essentially, I mean, they don't care what happens to you, I'm sorry to say. At the end of the day, they don't care. You have to look after yourself, and if you have a family or those support network around you. But eventually it got to the stage, I mean, things are getting more difficult in teaching-focused institutions. Less and less and less time for research, and even that 10%, I would say, is probably going to go pretty soon. So I took unpaid leave for 6 months, and I was already interested in going to China and had some connections. Yue is my dear friend. And yeah, I just thought I need to do something a bit different. So in a sense, I'm now doing what is sort of the equivalent to a postdoc, I guess, or a fellowship. Not a very well paid one, to be honest with you, but paid. So I'm sort of going back to, I guess, what the ideal would have been after a PhD. I'm sure I'm not alone in hoping and having hoped that I would have gone on to do a research project of some sort after my PhD, but that wasn't, that just didn't happen. So I feel quite positive now because I am going back to what I really wanted to do, and places like China, I should say as a little plug, offer those kind of opportunities that you just don't get in the UK anymore to do your own stuff for a couple of years. You just wouldn't get it. So yeah, that's where I am now. Sorry, a little bit long-winded, but thanks for asking.
Any other people wants to? Oh, I thought you wanted to say. Yeah.
Would like to ask the three
I think postdocs are probably the ideal for everybody. I would have loved a postdoc. I didn't end up with a postdoc, so I think one thing to bear in mind is as much as you might want to find one of those postdocs, and I definitely encourage you to look for those and find those looking through the relevant research councils, for example. Don't maybe set your heart on one of them and look what other things there are there. Use conferences like BERA to network with people. You'll know if you're in final year by now who the big names are in your field or those who are doing work in space that you want to work in. So speak with those people. If it's one thing I found of academia, it's that more often than not, those big names that might seem scary, you've read their work, you've never met them, are often really warm and welcoming when it comes to speaking with them at conferences, as daunting as that can sometimes seem, I think. So don't be afraid to go and speak to them, explain your position and what your interests are. I don't think there's any harm in doing that and seeing what opportunities they may have. But I think, again, I'll reiterate that point that postdocs are the ideal, but in our field, they aren't as common, say, as in maybe some of the STEM subjects. So they can be more difficult to come by, and it might be doing what some of us have done and taking a bit more of a convoluted route to get where you want to go eventually. Anything else?
Yeah, I think one of the points that Helen made is you've got to put food on the table, right? So, so there is that. So in a way, you take what you can. So I went from PhD to 2 part-time jobs in the same institution, one of which was academic, one of which wasn't. And both were massively useful in different ways. And then I managed to get lucky and get a permanent teaching position in a kind of a teaching-oriented university. And yeah, it's not a bad route to take, actually. There are lots of things I really liked about my last job. There are some things I didn't, and that's always the way. But then, and the other thing that Helen kind of alluded to is that the academic job market looks really quite different in different countries. So one of the things that's really interesting in the UK is you can get a permanent job relatively early in your career, whereas if you go to somewhere like Germany, you don't get a permanent academic job until really late in your career. So there are different ways of doing it, and it also depends on how mobile you are. Like, in a way, a postdoc kind of assumes that you can kind of up sticks and move somewhere else in the country. I can't do that. I mean, I've just moved an hour up the road, and the turmoil and the hassle for the kids and family and stuff it's just brutal in a way. So, I mean, you piece it together based on whatever you can find. So, as Helen kind of said, it's not necessarily a choice. You take what you can, and slowly you try and move forwards and upwards, in a sense, is probably how it works. In terms of looking for jobs, jobs.ac.uk is the go-to place for the UK. Also, you see a lot of stuff on Twitter. And then usually it crops up on jobs.ac.uk, but you kind of see what's going on. So I know, for example, in my field, I'm not looking for jobs, but I know that Portsmouth has got jobs going. I'm not sure why. Yeah, because he left. So that Portsmouth's got 2 jobs going, and then there's a job going at Durham as well, which is probably a little bit further on in career terms, but you just kind of know what's around. But as Oliver said, postdocs are kind of fairly thin on the ground. There was a period where the ESRC didn't fund postdocs anymore, and now has started to, and they've started to become built into like doctoral training partnerships and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's mix and match, I think, is kind of
I guess this comes back to something that both Richard and Helen mentioned about mentors and having that mentorship, and I think that's where I found a lot of those intellectual resources post-PhD. One of my key mentors isn't one of my supervisors, but she's been pivotal in shaping my career. She helped me get a research post alongside in my final year. You'll see on my trajectory I've hung around in the one place quite a lot. I feel like I've got a bit of an affinity towards Loughborough. And that's perhaps been because of the people who've been there and the mentorship that I've received. I'm really fortunate to be surrounded by some really wonderful women in academia at Loughborough. And that's what's held me there. I'm now reaching a point where that might be that I deviate and maybe look somewhere else and break out of that Loughborough bubble as it's known. But for me, mentorship has been really, really key in getting that intellectual resource and sort of moving me on. You'll see I did a teaching associate post where I didn't really have an awful lot of research allocation post-PhD, but by having those mentors, I was able to stay on board with projects and sort of keep connected in and keep progressing and moving forwards despite not being in a post that necessarily facilitated that. And that was when maybe my research was a bit more of a hobby, when I was doing it in the evenings and on the weekends. Not that I would advocate that, but it helped me stay involved and move on and keep moving forwards, I guess.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with what Oliver said. I mean, yeah, as I said, if you're not finding your intellectual stimulation within your institution, then you have to find it elsewhere, and and in some ways that's a good thing. There are pluses and minuses. There are really good things about having a good network where you are, and certainly if I could have got that, I would have opted for that. But if you don't have that, then it sort of forces you, I suppose, to maybe go outside of your normal environment and outside of your comfort zone, and to draw strength from other people, and to go a bit further in finding people that you can connect with, because it can be very isolating. And it can be very lonely. I mean, if you're doing a PhD now, you know what that feels like. But unfortunately, that doesn't really go away even into an academic life. Even if you're surrounded by people who are doing a similar job, they can have a very different outlook to you. So really finding those, it's all about people, really. I mean, that sounds a little bit trite, but it really is all about people. They're the ones that motivate you. Maybe those are the ones that you do your research with. I mean, it's really all people focus. So if you can find the right people, you can survive and thrive, as I mentioned.
I think that kind of sums it up super nicely.
I just want to quickly add also, we talk a lot about research-informed teaching, but also there's another way around, like you talk about teaching-informed research. Like we worked in post-92 universities, which are teaching-led, but you might not have that many opportunities to be exposed to Australian research culture, but there are many issues with teaching in this kind of settings. However, then, because you're so keen also to solve those problems as a kind of motivation, and then those motivations and ideas all could become potentially your research topics and the research areas as well. So teaching-informed research could also be another way around to develop your intellectual stimulus and things. Yeah, I've got a lady over there wants to say something. Yeah.
I'm not sure I can answer the whole question, but on the last part, I think it is something that's really common. Quick heads up, for the next issue of Research Intelligence, we've actually got 3 other ECRs reflecting on sort of that struggle about negotiating an identity, especially perhaps where they've had a teaching career and a teaching background, moved into academia, and as you say, it's kind of renegotiating that identity and seeing where you fit. I guess having read those 3 reflections and reflecting on those myself, what I would say is that I think those 3 ECRs all found that it's important to embrace that past identity and carry it forward. I think at first they perhaps struggled thinking that it was a whole new identity and that the past was the past and, okay, I'm an academic now, what does that look like? But that teacher identity that you've had and that leader identity from the past will inevitably shape who you are and what you want to be as an academic. So I think it's important to, I guess, embrace that past identity and sort of help merge it into the future one. I'm not sure if any of my colleagues can add.
I'd say kind of the obvious point is actually it's not you that's the problem, it's the system, in that we operate within a we operate within a cultural field which kind of assumes that this is good. So essentially it's old white male professor and everything kind of goes down in hierarchy from there, right? An old white professor has been publishing for 20 years, hasn't had to do any teaching because they farmed it out to someone else. And so they've got 8 million books and blah, 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 and 25 million pounds of grants in the last 20 years. But actually, if you think about it differently, even though some people don't, it's actually all about collegiality. And the point that Helen's making is basically about the people. And there's a whole load of stuff that you bring that other people do not have. And actually, if we think about it from the point of diversity, of actually having different people around a table, essentially, you bring a whole lot of stuff that other people don't have. And they'll bring stuff. So essentially, if you sit down in a fairly equal power relationship with people, you all learn from each other, and there's stuff that you can share, and there's stuff that they can share. And actually, this idea of hierarchies within higher education is more problematic than anything. So it's not you, it's us.
Oh, I don't have an answer for you, Suzanne, but I can just tell everyone that Suzanne is an incredibly supportive person. I follow her on Twitter. She's always running wonderful things. She always says wonderful, lovely things when you're presenting. So you're a wonderful person, Suzanne, and I really appreciate you.
I just want to say that I started my job at Portsmouth together with another colleague of mine who is at a kind of similar situation to you, but I have learned a lot from him, and he has been so helpful, bringing his experiences and inspiring me. So that could also be an important linking to what Richard has said, like this diversity. I have learned so much from my colleague, although in academia, he is at the same stage as I am at that moment, but in terms of this wide lifespan and experiences and everything, he has helped me a lot with his experiences prior to research and prior to PhD, so that's also an important part, I think. Yeah. Hope we give you a little bit then. Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's absolutely spot on. And then what that means is for people who are further ahead, it's absolutely key that, first of all, we don't pull the ladder up after ourselves, and also that we try to do things differently. You know, I mean, the difficulty is that you mentioned the REF. So the REF encourages institutions to enroll as many PhD students as possible because you get scored based on how many PhD students you complete, and this kind of thing. And this notion around part-time jobs, I mean, there is a much better way of doing it than 0.3, 0.5. It's cheap for the institutions, but it's crap for people, and it's crap for careers. So yeah, we need to do stuff differently. It's really, really important to recognise that.
Really, thanks for that. Any more questions before we still have a couple? Oh, yeah.
I was just going to mention already, but I wanted to thank you for actually acknowledging that everybody doesn't come to a PhD as a 23-year-old to live on a student budget. Because when I first raised that in my space and context, people looked at me like I'd grown 3 heads, and the audacity of me to suggest that I actually still need to meet my obligations and work and all the rest of it. So thank you for acknowledging that. This is the first case I've heard that. I wanted to just ask how you managed, and it may be too personal, so I apologise if it's, I think one of the hardest things is you get your piece of paper. So in completing your PhD, there's lots of conversations people were having with me about, well, not yet, get your piece of paper first, get your piece of paper first. And so you get your piece of paper, and that notion of identity crisis, but before I even hit that identity crisis, it's like a big black hole. I've got my piece of paper, but I don't know about the identity, I'm just lost. You know, thinking back, if you could think back to when you might have been in that phase, what were some of the coping strategies or approaches that, you know, how do you manage yourself? Because I think there's a mental health issue there in how vulnerable we become when we get that piece of paper, and I totally lost ourselves in that process of getting that piece of paper. So I just wondered if there was anything you could share in terms of, you know, getting along this timeline, but first we have to actually do something with that piece of paper and who we are. Does that make sense? Sorry, it's coming out in a very probably raw way, but I don't mean in that way.
I have no issue with sharing personal stories. So the last year of my PhD, when I was unfunded and working full-time and writing up, and then the year after that of being in essentially 2 0.5 positions, which essentially could have come to an end at various points, was unpleasant, I think would be an understatement. I mean, it's crazy in a way, kind of joining on to your point, that I felt lucky that I had 2 part-time limited term contracts in the same institution. What the hell? Seriously?
Because you have to be really grateful for every opportunity you're given, but there's a piece of you that's actually really struggling. So how do we look at ourselves and manage that space for ourselves?
Yeah, and the other thing you kind of mentioned, which is really interesting, is the notion of having that piece of paper. And the problem is the PhD is a necessary but insufficient condition for travelling further in your career. So you need to have it, but it's not the only thing you need to have. So if you put all of your eggs in that basket, you do end up in that kind of gap in between. And there's that really interesting thing, coming back to your points about identity, or the discussion around identity, is that as you go from, when I had this is my second career, and I was doing all right in the first career, but I got bored. I'm obviously not going to get bored here. But then, but at the same time, you kind of all of a sudden you find yourself at the bottom of the tree and you're looking up, right? And that's really difficult. And again, kind of coming back to the discussion, it's about the problems with the tree. It should be flat in some ways, and it should be inclusive, and it should be much more family-oriented and much friendlier than the system which it is. I mean, the system is exclusive in the way that it operates. And I'll also fully hold my hand up to accept my privilege, right? Being a posh white man, it's much easier for me than it is for a lot of other people. So, my wheels have been greased already before I even started.
Slightly differently, I would say that the challenges that I face as an academic have been far worse than anything I experienced doing PhD. And I know that sounds a little bit dramatic, but I felt like in the PhD, I felt quite in control, I think. I sort of knew what the steps were. I mean, I had a good supervisor that really makes all the difference. And I had quite a lot of freedom, so in a sense it was sort of a natural transition from studying part-time into doing that all of the time. So personally, I have to be honest, I know this sounds a little bit annoying, but that was okay for me. But the challenges of working within an institution, that I didn't really agree with the so-called values that they had, I found that much, much more challenging. And that's where I have had more of my darker moments, or the black hole that you're describing. And luckily I found a way sort of out of that, but still remaining with the academic life, because I do believe in education and I don't know what else I would do. I really enjoy I enjoy being within education, and I enjoy doing research. So I suppose as much as the PhD, of course, can get you the job, and perhaps people think of you differently. I mean, I don't really know. I've never asked anyone what they think about the fact I've got a PhD. Certainly, my family don't think it makes any difference to my mood. But what was I saying there? But yes, I suppose in time that fades a little bit. Even the PhD stuff, even some of the difficult things, they do fade over time. And I find even the more negative experiences I had in my early academic career have also faded now, thankfully. And even within the institution, that I think I tired myself out trying to challenge some inequalities, because I did take that responsibility very seriously to try and improve things for other people, and I felt that I failed in that way. And I personally, I felt like I suffered. I mean, you've heard these stories many times, but all of those things do fade, so that the PhD, in a more philosophical way, I suppose, becomes a part of your life, but you've now moved into something else. So even if you're within that more difficult, darker time, there's something beyond it. Yeah.
I just want to share, because my mentality has totally changed after my third year for my PhD, because then I was so lucky to get a full-time job and permanent in a teaching-led university, but it was stressful that you have to manage a full-time teaching-led academic post, and at the same time you have to finish your PhD. And I had this pressure from both my employer and my university of where I did my PhD, that you have to finish in 1 year's time or something. But actually my mentality changed, because you're doing something somehow totally unrelated, so you find it so precious and so great when you are going back to do your PhD bits. So in terms of managing that, whereas when I was in my third year, that you are only doing your PhD as your only one thing as your work, you might find like, what am I supposed to do? I think I finished watching a lot of Chinese drama series in my third year, because when you are unable to write and you're unable to do anything, then you watch dramas. But because you're doing something different, and then this gives you a kind of thing that you can come back to do that, and you find it's really great to do your PhD. So my suggestion in terms of managing that kind of pressure within your PhD phase is actually to find something else to do alongside your PhD. It doesn't have to be massive, but something totally different could help you reduce that kind of stress to some extent, yeah. Do you want to say something, Ali?
Yeah, and I think I'm just coming out of that phase of being quite doubtful. And I think for me, it's been getting over that expectation of the system, I guess, that you'll finish PhD and you'll be in a position where you're ready to go into a lecturing post, and that if you don't go into a lecturing post, then you've done something wrong or you aren't good enough. And I struggled with that for quite a while, and I think I'm probably just over that now. I'm in a research associate post where I'm not really certain what will come next, but I'm over that expectation that I failed if I haven't gone straight into a lecturing post, and I think that can take time to come to terms with, or at least for me it did. And I think it comes back again for me to this idea, and that everyone's mentioned, of people. There are times over the course of the PhD process, and especially after you've got it and you're starting to find your way as an academic a little bit more, that you can lose faith in yourself. And that's where it's so important to have those people around you, those mentors, those critical friends who will sort of reinstill that faith within you and let you know that, you know what, you have worth, you have that potential, and just to keep at it, I think sometimes you need some support from other people. I'm conscious of time, and we are already a little bit over, so I don't want to make people late for sessions. So on that note, I'd like to thank our two invited speakers, Richard and Helen, for their time. Thank you to all of you for coming along and engaging and sharing your thoughts with us. We really, really enjoy these sessions, and we hope you did too. There will be another one next year, topic TBC, but we will communicate that when we've decided on it. If you have any good ideas, please let us know. But other than that, thank you again for your time. If we could just have a round of applause for our speakers.